In the hours after the supper broke apart, the pot itself became evidence. Neighbors and kin carried it to a back porch and lifted the lid, looking for the mark of a deliberate poison, but what they found was a familiar mess of chopped greens. The doctor watched the basin fills and emptied, then asked where the greens had come from, when they had been gathered, and how long they had been boiled. No one gave the same answer twice. The failure was simple and hard to undo. The meal could not be traced. Some insisted the shoots were taken young from a fence row. Others remembered larger stems and a reddish cast that suggested older growth. One person swore the first water was poured off. Another said the pot never left the stove long enough. Without a clear rule to point to, suspicion filled the gap, and the cook's ordinary pride became a liability as talk of intent spread faster than facts. By dawn, the household faced a new limit. What remained of the greens had to be thrown out, yet the sickness kept unfolding hour after hour, with no sure way to judge who would worsen and who would recover. The doctor could offer only rinses, warmth, and watchfulness because the strength of the dose depended on parts and preparation no one could now prove. The plant stayed common along the road, but the community's confidence in it did not. There was a reason the doctor's questions landed on gathering and boiling. Long before any family trusted a pot of poke, people on this continent met the plant in the places they cleared and disturbed, along field edges, fence rows, and burn sites where it rose fast and thick. Indigenous communities and early settlers tested it as they tested other roots and greens, by use and consequence. They learned it could move the body hard, and they kept track of that power. That knowledge did not stay private for long. Pokeweed entered shared practice as a named thing, traded in talk, carried in bundles, and marked out from harmless weeds by the color it left behind. The berries stained hands and cloth a deep purple, and that stain became a household proof that the plant was worth keeping for ink, for dye, and for small uses when other supplies ran short. But the same plant that colored thread also punished mistakes, and the punishment did not always look the same twice. As the name traveled, so did the idea that poke could be handled. People repeated what seemed to work. A little for purging, a little for swelling, berries for color, leaves for springtime. The limit was built into the plant itself. Parts changed with age, and strength shifted with season. Yet those shifts were hard to see once poke became familiar. Familiarity closed off the simplest warning, the one that stopped a hand at the stem. Now the danger hid inside routine, waiting for confidence to outrun caution. As gardens failed or money ran thin, more tables depended on what could be cut from a ditch bank and made to stretch. Pokeweed, when it rose in early spring, offered the right look. Tender shoots, quick to gather, green enough to stand in for store-bought vegetables. Households treated the stove as the barrier between harm and food. The method circulated hand to hand. Parboil, drain, boil again, until the dish had a name of its own, poke sallet. But the method never came with measurements that held. Some cooks cut only the smallest shoots. Others took thicker stems once the plant had already reddened. One kitchen changed the water once, another twice, and another let the pot sit in the same liquor, believing time did what draining did not. The work left little evidence afterward, because the water that carried the bitterness went out into the yard. When sickness followed, there was no way to prove whether the plant had been too old or the boiling too few. The dangerous turn was that success looked like confirmation. When a family ate poke sallet and felt no ill effects, the practice hardened into certainty, and the next forager cut with less hesitation. Yet the plant's strength shifted with what was gathered and when, and that change stayed hidden once everything was chopped and cooked down to the same soft green. Cooking became a promise people repeated without sharing the same rules. It kept poke on the table, and it also kept failure waiting, hard to see until it happened. Once pokeweed sat in the kitchen as a rule of thumb green, it also moved into the doctor's bag as a rule of thumb drug. 18th and early 19th century practitioners listed it in handwritten notes and printed dispensatories, naming it an alterative and a purgative, and they put it to work against complaints that did not yield to mild means. They dried the root, steeped it into decoctions, or made tinctures to measure by drops, then advised patients to take it until the body responded. Print created a new kind of confidence, and it pushed the plant past the old kitchen limits. Recipes for Phytolacca appeared beside other strong drugs, and directions traveled farther than the cautions that normally followed a local healer's hand. The trouble was that the very part most used by physicians, the root, carried a reputation for force, and the force varied with age and storage. When vomiting and purging came hard, it could be read as proof the medicine worked, not as a sign it had gone too far. That logic made poke difficult to contain once it wore a medical name. Patients asked for it by reputation, and country doctors reached for it again when chronic swellings returned or when a previous dose seemed to have shifted something. But every repeat dose raised the stakes, because the line between enough to move the system and enough to break it stayed thin and personal. Authority no longer reduced risk. It multiplied the occasions for stronger preparations and wider experimentation. Once poke carried a medical name, it also carried a price. By the early 19th century, sellers blended dried poke root and berries into bottled vegetable remedies meant for swelling, rheumatism, and skin troubles, then shipped them by wagon and packet boat. Labels promised purification of the blood and quick relief, and the promise rested on a simple proof. The dose made itself known. A medicine that moved the stomach could be shown to work. Commercial trade changed what people expected from the plant. Patent medicines competed for attention in newspapers and on broadsides, and traveling vendors pushed stronger preparations because a mild bottle did not earn repeat buyers. Poke appeared beside alcohol, opiates, and other harsh ingredients, sometimes under Latin names and sometimes under plain ones, so customers could not judge what they swallowed. The same violent purge that warned a careful household now served as advertising. The new problem was control, and it did not come back easily. A cook could be questioned about gathering and boiling, but a bottle could pass from hand to hand with no witness to its making, no shared standard for drops or spoonfuls, and no easy way to trace who had concentrated the plant. When the sick improved after suffering, the seller claimed success. When they worsened, the blame fell on the body, not the dose. Poke's reputation spread faster than any caution that could follow it. As bottled cures and home brews spread, towns began to collect the same small reports. Children picked the dark berries that hung in easy reach and chewed them like fruit, then started vomiting before anyone thought of a doctor. In herb gardens and kitchens, dried roots were traded and stored in jars with hand-cut labels, and mistakes followed when a root meant for one purpose got shaved into another. The plant stayed ordinary. The accidents did not. The hardest cases came from preparation that looked careful. A household boiled a root into a thick decoction, or a healer steeped a stronger batch to show results, then watched the patient purge past the point of relief. When the water would not stay down, weakness followed fast, and families blamed bad stomachs, spoiled food, or the season itself. Each explanation protected the practice, so the warning never landed in a single place where it could be acted on. Word still traveled, and it changed the way communities handled the plant without settling what to do. Some families stopped letting children play near the berry stalks, yet kept poke in the spring pot. Some refused any bottled remedy that named it, yet trusted a neighbor's jar. The harm became a story people repeated under their breath, then denied when pressed. That split left a limit no one could fix. Knowledge spread, but agreement did not, and the same errors stayed available to the next hand. Once the stories of harm spread without settling the rules, hard times turned those half-rules into shortcuts. In the mid-19th century, war, displacement, and failed crops left more families depending on what grew without planting. Poke rose where soil was turned and fences were repaired close enough to cut on the way home. What had been a seasonal practice became a stopgap meal, gathered fast, cooked fast, and served because there was little else to serve. Haste changed the plant that reached the pot. When spring work ran long, people cut what stood tallest, not what stayed safest, and thicker stems and red-tinged shoots slipped in with the tender ones. Fuel cost and fatigue cut down the boilings, and a single scalding sometimes replaced the old drain-and-repeat routine. In some kitchens, the leaves went in with the shoots, and even small pieces of root rode along in the washwater. The same dish name covered a wider range of risk. That shift weakened the only control most households still had: repeatable preparation. Once poke sallet became a necessity, there was no easy way to stop serving it after a close call, because need returned the next day. Bad outcomes looked like bad luck, or like a weak stomach, because the pot rarely held the same parts twice. The plant stayed common and the method grew looser, and that combination made a mistake more likely to be repeated before anyone could prove what had gone wrong. As the 19th century wore on, poke sallet stopped sounding like a stopgap and started sounding like home. Community cookbooks, local newspaper columns, and fair day gatherings treated it as a known dish, something a household either could make or could not. A plate of greens became a small test of belonging. The plant's risks did not vanish, but the way people talked about those risks shifted, because the dish now carried meaning beyond the pot. That new meaning created a trap. When someone hesitated at the reddish stems or asked how many boilings had been done, the question landed as a judgment on the cook and the place itself, not as caution about a plant. Jokes and songs turned poke into shorthand for hardiness, and the people most likely to warn, newcomers, travelers, or the timid, were easiest to dismiss. The safer choice, refusing the greens, started to look like an insult. Social pressure changed how danger got reported. A family that fell sick after a poke supper had reason to blame bad stomachs or spoiled meat rather than admit the greens had been cut too old or boiled too little. Cooks tightened their certainty instead of their method, because reputation now depended on confidence. That made the mistake harder to correct, since every close call could be explained away, and each serving taught the next table that nothing was wrong. By the late 19th century, poke suppers did not stay private for long. Local papers printed short items about greens that sent church groups, harvest crews, and reunion tables into sudden sickness, and physicians noted the same cases in their ledgers as food poisoning by a familiar plant. The first assumption held steady. The trouble came from handling, not from malice. Editors listed who cooked, who gathered, and where the meal was served, as if a simple chain of facts could settle it. That chain rarely held. Communal meals mixed responsibility, and reports showed how quickly certainty broke apart when several households shared one dish. A guest arrived with a bucket of shoots already cut, a host seasoned and boiled them, and a doctor later testified that poke had been used safely in springtime. When diners fell ill anyway, each link became a target. The cook pointed to the forager to the doctor's earlier praise, and the doctor to poor boiling he never witnessed. No account could be checked after the pot was emptied and the water thrown out. Once newspapers carried names, accidents began to look like offenses. A sickness cluster after a picnic no longer read as bad luck, but as carelessness. then as recklessness, and finally, in some columns, as something close to intent. The same plant moved between kitchen and sick room, so an old recommendation could be recast as complicity, and a cook's confidence could be recast as a threat. Public scrutiny tightened the story around blame, not method, and that made the next outbreak harder to contain, because admitting a mistake now carried a cost that many households avoided. In the days that followed, the sick room turned into a kind of hearing. The doctor wrote down who had eaten most, who had tasted only broth, who had already used poke as spring medicine, and who swore it had fed their parents without trouble. Neighbors revisited the fence row where the shoots had been cut and pointed out red stalks left standing, proof to some that the picking had run too late. Others treated the same evidence as ordinary greens, handled wrong. The effort to settle on one cause broke down over a problem no one could repair. The dose left no fixed measure behind. The pot had been scraped clean or thrown out, the boiling water had been dumped, and the shoots had been chopped past recognition. Every explanation protected someone. If it had been ignorance, the cook could be pitied. If it had been pride, the cook could be blamed. If it had been poison, then the whole supper became a crime without a weapon that could be shown. With no verdict that held, households adjusted in ways that pulled in opposite directions. Some stopped serving poke and treated any mention of it as a warning, while others doubled down on the old routine and added extra boilings, as if more steps erased doubt. The plant kept returning along the same disturbed ground, and so did the temptation to treat familiarity as proof. The lasting risk was not just the weed, but the fact that a tradition could be used to excuse carelessness or to hide intent, and neither could be disproved afterward.